Hey guys, tonight we tumble backward into velvet-draped rooms and gaslit corridors, where the wallpaper peels quietly while you stare wide-eyed into the nothingness of 3 a.m. The air smells like boiled milk and mothballs, and even your nightshirt feels too heavy on your chest. Outside, a horse-drawn carriage clatters like a skeletal drumbeat. You close your eyes, praying for sleep, but the buzzing won't stop inside your skull, inside your groin. You have to wonder, is it the mutton? Or was it what you did earlier, alone, under the covers, while picturing your neighbor's bare ankles? You are not alone in this. Welcome to Victorian England, where insomnia wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a moral failing. A damning red flag. A ticket to medical treatment, public shame, or even surgical intervention. Yes, that kind of surgery. You probably won't survive this, but not because of any killer twist. Just because this story might cause irreversible secondhand embarrassment. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from, and how late it is in your corner of history. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's a few minutes past midnight in your rented attic room above the butcher's shop. You lie on a hard mattress stuffed with straw and questionable gray lumps that might once have been feathers. Through a hairline crack in the wall, you can hear mice arguing in the dark. You've blown out your candle. You've counted sheep, recited psalms, drank lukewarm milk, laced with valerian. Still awake, your thoughts are racing. Your hand inches toward your waistband, and that's exactly the problem. Because in this era, Victorian England, let's call it Britain's most constipated phase, being unable to sleep was rarely treated as a neurological condition or even a natural reaction to stress. Instead, it was often framed as a sign you'd been tampering with yourself in the dark. And not just framed, it was pathologized, moralized, and sometimes surgically punished. All because your libido didn't want to cooperate with Protestant work ethic. The Victorians were obsessed with sleep, but more than that, they were terrified of what it meant to lose it. The ideal Victorian sleeper was someone who drifted off immediately, slept for exactly 8 hours in complete stillness, and never once dreamed of anyone's bosom. Deviations from that were treated less like medical curiosities and more like spiritual crimes. You, writhing in your bed, gritting your teeth, were presumed guilty. Guilty of indulgence. Guilty of touching. Guilty of polluting yourself and, by extension, society. And if you were a young man, the consequences were especially severe. Seminal loss, doctors warned, could lead to brain exhaustion, heart palpitations, blindness, even death. Yes, losing sleep and losing sperm were considered basically the same sin, with similarly mortal consequences. Imagine this. You're a 17-year-old clerk in a London accounting office. You work 12 hours a day, scribbling columns of numbers by gaslight until your spine folds like a question mark. At night, you lie down still humming with mental noise, but you can't sleep. So you relieve yourself, quietly, repeatedly, a week. Later, you begin complaining of headaches, of fatigue, of twitching muscles and dreams you can't explain. Your mother notices. She calls the family doctor, who presses your wrist, peers into your eyes, and declares you morally depleted. He recommends cold baths, a bland diet, no reading after dark, and a leather harness to prevent nocturnal temptation. And if that doesn't work, surgery, a little snip. Problem solved. You still can't sleep, but at least now you're pure. And before you think this is some fringe practice, think again. The British medical establishment of the 19th century was drowning in pamphlets warning about the dangers of solitary vice. Masturbation was blamed for everything from poor posture to suicidal ideation to, of course, insomnia. One popular physician, Dr. William Acton, insisted that the vile practice of self-abuse was responsible for what he called nocturnal emissions of the soul. Yes, that's a real quote. And no, he never quite explains what that means. But the point was clear. Masturbation didn't just stain your sheets, it stained your character. And once your character was compromised, your body would soon follow. Sleeplessness was just the canary in the coal mine of your collapsing virtue. Meanwhile, upstairs in the drawing rooms of wealthier homes, women too were tossing and turning. But their insomnia wore different clothes-flowing lace gowns and a polite diagnosis called female hysteria. These women weren't accused of masturbating. That would be scandalous. Instead, they were treated for being too emotionally sensitive. The cure? Pelvic massage, administered by doctors, with machines in dim rooms for medical reasons. That's not a joke, though it feels like one. According to Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, some female patients even scheduled multiple sessions per week, though they claimed they still couldn't sleep. Historians still argue whether these treatments were acts of ignorance or quiet rebellion, but either way, the double standard is clear. For men, self-pleasure was a disease. For women, it was a cure, as long as someone else was doing it. This isn't just a story about sex, though. It's a story about fear, about control, about how a society obsessed with order and decorum ended up weaponizing sleeplessness. You'll see how the Victorian state became a bedroom surveillance network, how furniture was redesigned to thwart your midnight urges, and how even time itself, regulated by ticking clocks and factory bells, became a weapon in the war against pleasure. We'll meet poets who wandered the gaslit streets of London in search of moonlit peace. We'll read journals full of erotic nightmares disguised as case studies. And we'll watch the medical world tie itself in knots, trying to explain why the human body kept betraying Victorian ideals of purity, restraint, and discipline. But for now, you're just a body in a room, sleepless, itching with questions and shame, listening to the creaks of the house and the occasional fart of a passing horse, wondering what exactly is wrong with you. Don't worry. That confusion is part of the design. Because in the Victorian era, insomnia wasn't treated, it was judged. And you, my poor restless friend, are about to be judged very harshly. You wake up tired, or maybe you never really slept. Either way, your body is a tight coil of nerves, your thoughts already sprinting before your boots hit the cold wooden floor. It's the 1850s, and outside, England is screaming into modernity. Steam engines howl like mechanical wolves, chimneys belch their soot into the lungs of a waking empire, and train stations tick with military precision. You are part of this roaring machine now. You punch in, push paper, or swing hammers beside 10-year-olds with soot-streaked cheeks and 1,000-yard stares. But something's off. People everywhere are yawning at odd hours, forgetting their children's names, collapsing on factory floors, or muttering to themselves on park benches. Nervous disorders, the doctors say. Overstimulation of the mind. Of course, no. One blames the relentless noise or the fact that artificial light is now keeping cities awake well past sunset. No, they turn to older villains: moral weakness, spiritual decay, and personal failure. Sleep, once a quiet private matter, is now a battleground of virtue. You sit on the omnibus and notice the man beside you scratching at his scalp and whispering a prayer. He's not praying for forgiveness. He's praying for sleep. That's how bad it's gotten. Even the clergy are starting to look tired. In drawing rooms and smoky pubs alike, people talk about the sleep crisis, though the word crisis is whispered. Nobody wants to admit that something is cracking in the gears of progress. Doctors begin to notice the patterns. Sleeplessness among middle-class professionals, among anxious schoolboys, among women with too much idle time. They scribble new theories, linking insomnia to everything from reading novels to the vibrations of trains, One even suggests that the human brain is not designed to travel faster than 20 miles per hour. That's why you can't sleep. Because your soul can't keep up with the train. Makes sense, right? But here's the deeper current. Victorian doctors weren't just worried about overstimulation. They were panicking about control. A sleepless body is an undisciplined body, rebellious one. And when those bodies start multiplying across London and Manchester and Edinburgh, when men start calling in sick because they're feeling peculiar, when women write diary entries describing nights of trembling restlessness and phantom sensations, the establishment begins to twitch. Something unseen is haunting the population. And like clockwork, the fingers point inward. Toward the bedroom, toward the body, toward masturbation. It's perfect, really. You can't prove you didn't do it. There are no witnesses. Just the telltale symptoms: fatigue, irritability, and that dreadful pink around the eyes. Soon, pamphlets warn that self-abuse causes mental frailty, spinal curvature, and even stunted genital growth. Sleep loss is just the gateway drug. Your next stop is madness. That might sound ridiculous, but remember, this is an age when the body is considered a direct reflection of the soul. A weak sleeper must have a weak will. And what weakens the will more than pleasure without purpose? That's why masturbation is such a potent villain. It's pleasure that doesn't serve the empire. It doesn't produce children or strengthen marriages or advance careers. It's just you, under the blanket, chasing a ghost. And now that ghost is stealing your sleep. It's all so absurd it would be funny, except for the part where thousands of young people were institutionalized, scolded, and mutilated for it. Let's stop here for a sex story, because nothing captures Victorian contradiction like the secret habits of the powerful. Picture a European king, let's say King Ludwig of Bavaria, who ruled with opera in his ears and moonlight in his veins. Ludwig had a fondness for young male servants and an obsession with building fairy tale castles. But behind closed doors, he also suffered from insomnia. His doctors, uncomfortable with his sexuality and desperate to explain his restlessness, concluded that he must be overindulging in solitary practices. Their solution? A strict routine of prayer, cold baths, and supervised sleep, a royal bedtime patrol, essentially. Meanwhile, Ludwig wandered his palaces at night in velvet robes, composing letters to imaginary lovers and chewing laudanum tablets like candy. He died young, officially by drowning, but unofficially by having never quite fit into the moral straitjacket tailored for him. Back in England, Ludwig's story would be framed not as tragedy, but as a cautionary tale. That's how insidious the logic became. If you couldn't sleep, it meant you were guilty of something. And that guilt, in turn, stole more sleep. You spiraled. You worried. You tried not to touch yourself. You failed. Then you failed harder by not sleeping, and on it went. A Victorian doctor named Henry Maudsley even proposed that insomnia was a visceral rebellion against one's own bad choices. Your body rejecting you like a roommate who's tired of your mess. Quirky footnote time. One of the most popular sleep aids of the 1870s was not a drug, but a machine called the somnograph. It looked like a cross between a music box and a torture device and promised to monitor nightly emissions of both thought and fluid. Yes, it recorded your dreams and your orgasms. Or so it claimed. In truth, it was just a heavy thing you strapped to your chest to make it hard to roll over in bed. It didn't work, of course, but it sold in the hundreds. Because nothing screams sleep hygiene like Victorian brasswork and shame. Historians still argue whether these diagnoses were earnest mistakes or deliberate moral policing. Were doctors just doing their best with limited knowledge, or were they complicit in enforcing social control through pseudoscience? Did they really believe masturbation caused madness, or did they just find it convenient to blame? Some scholars suggest it was both. Genuine fear tangled with institutionalized repression. The line between belief and enforcement blurred so thoroughly that even well-meaning physicians ended up enforcing cruelty. And here's the part that really seals the coffin shut. Insomnia became contagious, not biologically, but culturally. People began to expect sleeplessness as a symptom of virtue. The harder you worked, the less you slept. The more noble your character, the more likely you were to lie awake wrestling with your conscience. It was romanticized in literature, spiritualized in sermons, weaponized in schools. A sleepless man was suffering for the good of the empire. A sleepless woman? Well, she was either too delicate or too dangerous. Either way, she needed supervision. You crawl into bed again, dreading the dark. You pray, you clench your hands. You think of Queen Victoria's solemn face and wonder what she'd say if she knew how often you touch yourself. Probably nothing. But her doctor might write you a long scolding letter about it. And if that doesn't put you to sleep, well, don't worry. We've only just started. The city sleeps mostly. Chimneys sigh their last smoke ribbons into the night. Gas lamps flicker like tired eyes. And the streets are scattered with puddles reflecting a moon that doesn't care how tired you are. You, of course, are still wide awake. You shift under your blanket, which smells faintly of mildew and cheap starch, and wonder why your body refuses to shut down like a proper factory. The mattress creaks every time you move, mocking your failure to perform the most basic biological function, sleep. But tonight, there's a new layer of dread. You saw a pamphlet at the apothecary today. Onanism and its sleep-destroying effects. A crude drawing of a pale-faced youth, shadows under his eyes like bruises, hands folded guiltily beneath a Bible. The caption read, "He who sins alone shall lie awake forever." Charming. It's not just awkward now, it's a crisis. Your restlessness isn't a symptom. It's a confession. See, in this era, medicine doesn't just treat bodies, it judges them. And doctors, many of them moonlighting as moral philosophers, have taken it upon themselves to sniff out the sources of societal decay. Enter the moral body police. They're not in uniform, but their reach is just as thorough. They're your family doctor, your pastor, your boarding school headmaster. They write long reports about your behavior, prescribe odd rituals, and sometimes inspect your sheets. If you're a young man, your semen is now a matter of public health. If you're a young woman, your sleep patterns can indicate everything, from uterine disorder to demonic possession. And everyone agrees, masturbation is the common thread. It's the invisible crime that leaves behind no fingerprints, only insomnia. That, and maybe a rash. These ideas don't appear from nowhere. They build on centuries of suspicion, but now the Victorians have a shiny new toy, pseudoscience. Phrenology, for one, offers a neat way to read your skull and find out just how depraved you are. A bump above your ear? That's amative instinct. Too pronounced, and you're clearly prone to self-pleasure. Combine that with sleeplessness, and suddenly your skull is basically a confession. Doctors begin to link nocturnal emissions with a weakening of the moral spine. Young men who can't sleep are warned that they may go blind or worse. Become poets. Let's talk about one of those poets, Algernon Charles Swinburne. Wild hair, wilder opinions, and a fondness for writing odes to sadomasochism and the sea. Swinburne suffered from chronic insomnia, which he blamed on his nervous imagination. His doctors, of course, were less poetic. They assumed he was engaging in nightly self-abuse. His remedy? Cold sponge baths and long walks at dawn. He once claimed he hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night in a decade. Whether that was true or just artistic exaggeration, the assumption stuck. Creative types were probably masturbating themselves mad. Swinburne, for all his flamboyance, fit the mold perfectly. Restless, pale, brilliant, and doomed. Back in more respectable drawing rooms, parents began to panic. What if their sons weren't sleeping because they were secretly defiling themselves? What if their daughter's dreams were corrupted by hidden lust? Victorian advice manuals exploded in popularity, filled with warnings like, never let your child sleep with the hands beneath the blanket, and encourage early rising and cold water dousing. Some even suggested stitching bells into children's pajamas to catch them in the act. If you were unlucky enough to be caught, the punishments ranged from dietary restrictions to physical restraints to public shaming. Some boys were even forced to wear leather devices around their genitals. Imagine a chastity belt, but less dignified. Let's detour into another sex story. This one features Empress Elizabeth of Austria-Sisi, as she was affectionately known. Famed for her beauty and cursed with royal boredom, Sisi suffered chronic insomnia and was obsessed with maintaining a 19-inch waistline. Her nighttime routine included being wrapped in vinegar-soaked cloth, sleeping upright in a specially designed contraption to avoid facial wrinkles, and occasionally requesting her chambermaids to read erotic poetry aloud until she nodded off. Her physicians, baffled by her restlessness, proposed that her sleeplessness stemmed from suppressed womanly energies, a polite way of saying she needed a proper outlet for her libido. One even suggested marriage counseling with a Jesuit priest. Sissy responded by riding horses at breakneck speed and composing angry poetry. Historians still argue whether her insomnia was psychological, physical, or simply the price of being a sentient woman in a world built for porcelain dolls. Meanwhile, science doubled down. In 1861, a best-selling medical manual claimed that every act of self-pollution subtracts exactly 5 minutes from the average human lifespan. This absurdly specific claim gave rise to sleepless guilt spirals. Every missed night was proof that your clock was ticking faster than everyone else's. You became your own executioner. Night after night, men and women lay stiffly under quilts, hands clenched, terrified that the slightest movement might betray them to their own conscience. Victorian bedrooms became battlegrounds, where morality fought biology with cold compresses and disapproving portraits. And speaking of biology, here's a fringe tidbit. Some Victorian thinkers believed that masturbation literally altered your facial structure. The term masturbator's mask referred to a drawn, sallow look, sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, and a perpetually anxious expression. According to this theory, you could diagnose a chronic offender just by looking at them. Imagine being 15, dealing with puberty, acne, and stress, and then having your teacher accuse you of moral degeneracy based on your cheekbones. That's the level of paranoia we're dealing with. Even the furniture turned hostile. Beds were redesigned with curved boards and iron rods to discourage movement. Boys' boarding schools implemented anti-onanism bed frames that tilted forward if you shifted too much. Some beds even had alarm systems, early motion detectors wired to bells in the matron's room. Privacy became a liability. Darkness, once a sanctuary, became a threat. It's hard to imagine sleeping soundly when your mattress is basically a snitch, yet the fear persisted. What made it all so effective was how deeply the guilt was internalized. Even those who didn't believe the wildest claims still found themselves lying awake, wondering, what if they're right? What if this buzzing in my head, this ache behind my eyes, this restlessness, isn't just stress, but punishment? And if that's true, what else am I guilty of? You lie there, silent, trying to breathe evenly. You tell yourself you'll sleep soon. You promise not to touch anything. You repeat Psalm 23 and count backward from 100. Still awake. Still haunted, not by ghosts, but by suspicion. You've entered the Victorian night, the long, twitchy corridor where pleasure is the enemy and sleep is a test of your moral worth. You wake in a cold sweat, or maybe you never slept at all. Just drifted in and out of uneasy stupor, while the shadows on your bedroom wall turned into clawed hands and judging eyes. The candle you left burning has guttered itself to a pool of wax, and somewhere a church bell tolls the cruel number 4. Morning isn't here yet, but night no longer feels like protection. You're exhausted, wired, and weirdly aroused. Again. You wonder, briefly, if you're dying. But then the more frightening thought creeps in. What if you're not dying? What if this is just your life now? Welcome to the world of Victorian female insomnia, a condition so common and so poorly understood that doctors started naming new syndromes for it faster than you can say virginal nervous system. And if you're a middle-class woman, congratulations. Your sleeplessness isn't just a problem, it's an opportunity for an entire male-dominated field to invent disorders, therapies, and products targeted specifically at your restless, dreaming, potentially sinful body. You see, by the 1860s, women's insomnia had become a medical genre all its own. It was treated not as a symptom of exhaustion or mental strain, but as a visible crack in the porcelain figurine of ideal womanhood. Proper Victorian ladies were supposed to be gentle, quiet, and oblivious to their own bodies. But what happens when they start describing burning sensations in the limbs? Or when they complain of waking up in the middle of the night with fluttering pulses and a dampness that feels unholy? Doctors exclusively male, of course, found themselves both scandalized and intrigued. They started drawing connections between insomnia and a whole new umbrella diagnosis, hysteria. A term that would soon balloon to include everything from menstrual cramps to orgasms. Especially orgasms. In fact, the link between hysteria and insomnia became so fashionable in medical circles that journals began to overflow with case studies. Miss C, age 28, unmarried, reports vivid dreams and nightly agitation. Translation: she can't sleep and may be experiencing something close to a sexual awakening. Diagnosis: hysteria. Recommended treatment: bed rest, vaginal massages, and a promise not to read French novels. Let's take a closer look at one of those treatments, because it might be the most unintentionally erotic chapter in the history of Western medicine. Enter the vibrator, not as a household gadget, but as a physician's tool. In the late 1800s, doctors began using mechanical devices to induce what they called hysterical paroxysms in female patients. These episodes, now more accurately labeled orgasms, were believed to release pent-up energy that was preventing sleep. The logic was mind-boggling. Women weren't allowed to know their own bodies or express desire, but if they couldn't sleep, a doctor could legally pleasure them with a machine, as long as everyone pretended it was strictly medicinal. One advertisement even promised that the device restores feminine calm and promotes restful slumber. It's no surprise that the vibrator became one of the first electric appliances to enter the home, just behind the sewing machine. Historians still argue whether the doctors involved were naively clinical or fully aware of the erotic implications. But one thing is clear: women's sleep became another arena in which their bodies were manipulated under the guise of health. Let's pause for a story less about medicine, more about mischief. The courtesan Cora Pearl, infamous in Parisian society, once bragged that she never needed sleep, only a fresh bath and a powdered wig. Her lovers included royalty and generals, and she was known for hosting parties where she'd emerge from a giant pie or bathe in milk while reciting Shakespeare. But even Cora, beneath the bravado, admitted in her memoirs that she suffered from nights of whirling thoughts and phantom touches. Historians believe her sleeplessness stemmed not from guilt or disease, but from the constant performance of desirability. In a society where sex was commerce and aging a curse, sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she danced on tables, wrote melancholy letters at dawn, and sometimes dosed herself with laudanum just to forget she had a body. Cora's story isn't an outlier, it's a mirror to Bayer, the countless women who were told that their restlessness was a fault to be fixed, rather than a symptom of lives lived under pressure and expectation. But let's not forget the darker rooms. The bedrooms of wives locked in marriages with men who saw them more as furniture than partners. These women often complained of waking too early or feeling like a trapped bird after midnight. Their doctors sometimes prescribed morphine, or nerve tonics that were mostly alcohol and sugar. Others were told to get more exercise, to bear children, or to be grateful. And if none of that worked, institutionalization. That's right. A sleepless wife could be sent to a rest home, where she'd be denied books, stripped of privacy, and subjected to hygrotherapy, a clinical term for cold showers, and being sprayed with high-pressure hoses. The logic was that sleeplessness in women stemmed from too much stimulation, so the solution was complete sensory deprivation. Lights out, voices hushed, food bland, and water ice cold. And if you screamed, well, that just confirmed the diagnosis. A quirky aside, one English boarding school for girls in the 1880s had a sleep matron, whose job was to walk the halls at night and check that no one was still awake after curfew. She carried a lantern and a notebook, and would mark the beds of those she suspected of fidgeting. Repeat offenders were made to sleep with their hands tied in lace ribbons. The school's headmistress claimed this was to encourage serenity. The girls called her the Angel of Dread. You can't make this stuff up. Meanwhile, men, especially those in power, began to view women's insomnia as either comic or erotic. A woman who couldn't sleep was too sensitive or in need of distraction. Victorian erotica often featured insomniac heroines who wandered the halls in sheer nightgowns, unable to rest until some male figure provided resolution. It's a twisted fantasy, but it shaped real perceptions. Medical journals, novels, and even early photography started to frame sleepless women as tragic, beautiful, and slightly dangerous, like wounded doves in need of careful handling or cages. The line between patient and prisoner blurred quickly. Yet for all this medical meddling and cultural confusion, the actual science of sleep remained murky. Most doctors couldn't explain why sleep happened at all, much less why it refused to. That didn't stop them from filling shells with theories. Some believed sleep was a kind of cerebral blood withdrawal, that your brain shut down by draining blood into your feet. Others thought it was an electrical reboot. Still others blamed moonlight, digestion, or impure thoughts. One physician even warned that sleep could be disrupted by looking too long at wallpaper with complex patterns. It agitates the feminine mind, wallpaper. That was the threat. Not poverty, not trauma, not daily repression wallpaper. You lying in bed tonight are not wallpapered, but you feel no less trapped. Your limbs buzz with restless energy. Your eyes ache from staring into darkness. And every creak of the floorboards sounds like someone coming to catch you. You wonder, absurdly, if the problem is your curtains. Maybe the pattern's too wild. Or maybe you're just cursed, or guilty, or hysterical. It doesn't matter. Because by now, you've learned that the cause of your insomnia isn't really the point. What matters is that it marks you. It makes you suspicious. It makes you a patient. And patients, in the Victorian age, don't get rest. They get diagnoses. You're standing in front of the mirror now, shirt lifted, eyes scanning your chest for signs. Not of illness exactly, but of weakness. Your hands tremble a little. Your eyes look sunken. Your skin feels clammy. Is it because you haven't slept in 3 nights? Or is it because of what you did last week, that moment of silent pleasure? You promised yourself would be the last? You tilt your head, try to remember that medical diagram you saw in a friend's bookshop, something about the spine, the seed, the loss. You wonder if your semen is still circulating in your blood like it should be, or if your last emission was a theft from your own vitality. Because in this strange, anxious century, your erections aren't private. They're public property. They belong to the future of the nation. And wasting them, especially alone, in bed, at night isn't just a personal shame. It's national sabotage. In the Victorian imagination, the male body was a battlefield of production. You were supposed to work hard, resist temptation, marry properly, and reproduce for queen and country. Every part of you had a purpose, especially the parts below the waist. Which is why, when insomnia crept into boys' dormitories and men's bedrooms, doctors didn't reach for neurological explanations. They reached for the pants. It wasn't enough that a man couldn't sleep. The real concern was why, and inevitably, the why was traced back to masturbation. Nocturnal emissions, once considered a harmless adolescent phase, became pathological events. Medical books claimed each one drained not just energy but essence. One doctor famously wrote that a single emission was equivalent to the loss of an ounce of blood, and that too many would cause cerebral degeneration. Young men were warned that if they didn't stop, they'd become feeble-minded, stoop-backed, pale-skinned, an entire breed of social failure known as masturbators. It wasn't a joke, it was a classification, a diagnosis. A life sentence. Now, think about that pressure. You're 19. You're working a grueling job with 6 roommates, sharing a bed with your cousin, and sleeping under a thin blanket that smells like soup and socks. You try to resist the urge, but the tension builds. You give in. The next morning, you feel tired, not because of what you did, but because you only got 4 hours of sleep. But the moment you mention the fatigue to anyone, the machinery activates. Someone tells the doctor. The doctor asks if you've been having dreams. The doctor asks if you've been waking up with stains on your nightshirt. You lie. He doesn't believe you. He prescribes a tonic made of quinine and chalk and tells you to avoid meat and mustard. That night, you sleep worse than ever. You're caught in a spiral. Sex story break. In the erotic spirit through history, there's mention of a Prussian nobleman who hired a full-time valet just to keep him from masturbating. The valet was instructed to sleep at the foot of the bed, facing his employer, and to jingle a bell if he noticed suspicious movements. The nobleman reportedly offered bonuses if the valet intervened successfully. Historians still debate whether this was extreme self-control or elaborate kink. Either way, the nobleman died young, possibly of stress-related cardiac arrest, or perhaps, some might say, from a lack of joyful release. Meanwhile, the concept of sexual continence gained momentum in the medical community. Doctors began writing about the conservation of semen as though it were gold bullion. One pamphlet titled "The Seed of Civilization" claimed that the frequency of ejaculation should match the agricultural calendar twice a year, ideally during harvest festivals. Too much, they warned, and your immune system would collapse. Too little, and your testicles might swell with unreleased potency and poison your mind. Sleep, therefore, became a delicate balance. Sleep too much, and you're slothful. Sleep too little, and you're suspect. Sleep restlessly, and it means your body is losing fluids through wicked, subconscious habits. The idea that erections could be accidental wasn't accepted. Any stirring was viewed as moral failure, especially when linked to insomnia. The devil works hardest between midnight and 4, warned one preacher, aligning perfectly with those twilight hours when insomniacs tossed, turned, and quietly negotiated with their flesh. Thus, Victorian doctors began to pathologize spontaneous arousal. It wasn't biology, it was rebellion. Your penis, they said, was capable of misbehavior. If you couldn't control it, someone else would have to cue the devices. Among the most infamous were the penile cages, tiny, intricate contraptions of brass or iron that wrapped around the genitals, often spiked to deter erection. Some were attached to waist belts to keep them from slipping, and others had small bells that would ring if the wearer stirred too much in their sleep. Inventors competed to design the most discreet, most painful, and most effective models. Patent records are full of them. Anti-solitary device, 1872. Moral harness for boys. Nocturnal monitor, Model V. They looked like miniature bear traps and felt like Shane wrapped in cold metal. And yes, they were marketed as sleep aids. Fringe tidbit. There was a brief but fascinating movement among certain Anglican reformers who advocated for moral sleepwear. These were long cotton nightgowns sewn closed at the hem, like fabric sleeping bags. They had no openings, forcing the wearer to sleep with arms and legs straight and together, like a mummy. One pamphlet claimed this posture discouraged both impure thoughts and digestive distress. They were called purity robes, and their popularity peaked just before the invention of elastic waistband pajamas. Thankfully, historians still argue whether Victorian sexual anxiety was truly about health or just a culturally encoded form of control. After all, many of the sleep disorders described in medical texts read more like panic attacks than biological afflictions. Patients were described as waking suddenly with a start, fearing they had died, or feeling as if watched by invisible eyes. Sounds a lot like guilt or surveillance, or both. The more doctors tried to explain the link between masturbation and insomnia, the more tortured the explanations became. One claimed that self-pleasure caused a psychic rupture between the soul and the sleep faculties. Another proposed that semen loss disrupted magnetic fields in the bedroom. These weren't metaphors, they were published theories. Sleep was no longer rest. It was a battleground. And your own body was both the enemy and the weapon. Now you lie in bed and do the math. How many times this month? Was it more than last month? Are your legs twitching more than usual? Is that a headache or the first sign of spinal decay? You stare at the ceiling, afraid to move. You make a silent vow. Tomorrow you'll be stronger. Tomorrow you won't give in, but tonight you don't sleep. You just count the seconds and wait for morning, praying that your body keeps your secrets for one more day. The clock ticks like a threat. Not a gentle lullaby, not a comforting beat. To measure your breaths by but a sharp mechanical accusation. Tick, you're still awake. Tick, you failed again. Tick, you're broken. That brass-faced guardian on your nightstand isn't there to help you. It's there to document your shame. Victorian England had fallen deeply in love with time, not the poetic kind, but the industrial kind. The kind that's measured in minutes lost, productivity wasted, and moral decay suspected. And now, even sleep had been absorbed into that relentless calculation. In the age of factories and railway timetables, the bedroom became just another workplace, and insomnia wasn't merely a health concern. It was a breach of duty. You weren't just tired. You were inefficient. And inefficiency, in this empire of ticking gears and churning steam, was a crime against progress. By the 1870s, sleep was being charted like rainfall or crop yields. Doctors kept logs. Parents kept diaries. Employers even kept tabs on workers who looked dream-heavy. One famous engineer was dismissed for frequent yawning during a shift, the manager citing a suspicious decline in nocturnal discipline. You read that right, his nighttime habits were now company business. And it wasn't just industrial jobs. Clerks, schoolboys, governesses all were expected to conform to the new standard of moral sleep, precise, efficient, and unbroken. If your sleep deviated from the norm, it meant something was wrong with you. Maybe physically, maybe spiritually, probably both. Time, once fluid and personal, was now rigid and external. Mechanical clocks invaded homes like missionaries of punctuality. Midnight no longer felt poetic. It felt like failure. The clock hands didn't move, they marched. And in the shadows of those disciplined hours, insomnia grew teeth. Because now, if you woke at 2:17 a.m., it wasn't just restlessness. It was a specific timestamp on your descent into moral decay. The obsession with timekeeping extended even into sleep hygiene. Manuals suggested ideal hours for bed, 10 p.m. sharp. For men, 9:30 p.m. for women, and any deviation was considered reckless. Those who retire late, warned one domestic guidebook, invite the devil into their dreams. Let's dig into how this moralized timekeeping played out in the bedroom. Victorian bedrooms were designed to enforce order. Curtains thick, enough to block moonlight, bedside tables for devotional literature, and no locks because privacy encouraged vice. One popular household item was the night journal. a tiny notebook where individuals were encouraged to record their dreams, wake times, and nocturnal disturbances. These journals were often reviewed by parents or spouses, and entries, like difficulty falling asleep or unsettling dreams, were met with dietary corrections or stern lectures. If you admitted to waking up suddenly with a racing heart, the assumption was not anxiety, it was guilt. Guilt for whatever imagined sin had slipped through the cracks of your consciousness. The night wasn't safe. It was under surveillance. Sex story detour. Consider the case of Tsar Alexander II of Russia, not Victorian, strictly speaking, but deeply entangled with European ideas about sex and discipline. According to Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, Alexander had an open preference for his mistress, Princess Catherine Dolgorukova, and visited her nightly. His official wife knew, his ministers knew, and the public knew. But the scandal wasn't the affair, it was the fact that the Tsar began showing signs of insomnia. Court doctors blamed excessive nighttime activities, and the Empress demanded he either cease the affair or submit to a sleep regimen. He refused both. Eventually, Catherine moved into a palace wing closer to his chambers, and Alexander was fitted with a new bed, engineered for spiritual tranquility. It didn't help. He died in a bombing. Whether sleep deprivation made him sloppy or just unlucky remains a point of debate. But either way, his bedroom habits were considered a matter of state security. Back in middle-class England, the obsession with punctuality bled into every part of sleep. Children were punished for waking late, even if they hadn't slept. Wives were chastised for indulgent drowsiness. One household manual insisted that servants should not sleep more than 6 hours per night unless they had performed a labor of great national value. Even dreams were held to account. If a young woman admitted to erotic dreams, she was advised to switch pillows and sleep facing east, because east, symbolically, faced the rising sun and therefore encouraged moral clarity. If you can't even sleep in the wrong direction without suspicion, what hope is there? One fringe example of time fetishism taken too far comes from a certain Reverend C.T. Halsey, who advocated the practice of nightly confession clocks. These devices required the user to wind them with a special key that had to be inserted through a tiny moral checklist. If you couldn't complete the checklist, things like, was I chaste? Did I waste time? Did I honor God with my dreams? The key would jam, the clock wouldn't tick. It was a Protestant Fitbit for your soul. The idea was that sleep should be a reward for daily virtue. If the clock wouldn't run, you weren't worthy of rest. Historians still argue whether these obsessive rituals were primarily religious in origin or just part of a wider cultural neurosis about control. Either way, they had the same effect, making people afraid to sleep unless they could prove they'd earned it. And since no one ever feels fully virtuous by Victorian standards, sleep became elusive. Even the upper classes weren't immune. The more you had to lose reputation, inheritance, societal standing, the more pressure there was to exhibit perfect sleep hygiene. It wasn't just about being well rested. It was about being above suspicion. Let's not forget the role of medical instrumentation, either. Victorian physicians began experimenting with early biometric tracking, mostly primitive, but still invasive. They'd attach tubes and needles to patients to measure breathing rates, body heat, and pulse. If the numbers looked wrong, the patient was diagnosed with nocturnal neurosis. And what caused this neurosis? Too much thinking, too much longing, too much time. One doctor even blamed prolonged mental exposure to literature of a romantic character. So yes, even reading the wrong book before bed could ruin your sleep and your social credibility. You, in your narrow bed, are starting to sweat again. You've been staring at the ceiling for hours. The clock on the dresser ticks so loudly you want to bury it in a pillow. But you don't, because you need to know the time. You need to see the proof that you are not, in fact, sleeping like a moral citizen. It's 2:41 a.m. You try to calculate how many hours of sleep you could still salvage. 5, 4.5. But your body's already twitching. Your mind's spinning. Your soul, if that's what this gnawing thing is, feels like it's floating somewhere just above your stomach, whispering that you've already failed tomorrow. You think about smashing the clock. But instead, you turn it to face the wall. Just for tonight. Just so you don't have to see the exact moment your dignity slips beneath the sheets again. Imagine it. You've spent 14 hours cleaning someone else's china. Your hands are raw. Your back is curved like a comma, and you can still smell. The soap lie in your fingernails. It's past midnight. The master's children finally stopped crying 2 hours ago. The mistress's corset has been unlaced and rehung, and the leftover stew you weren't supposed to touch now bubbles faintly. In your stomach. You should be unconscious with fatigue, but you're not. You're wide awake, lying on a straw mattress in the servant's attic, staring at a slanted wooden ceiling that leaks when it rains. Every creak of the floorboards above sends a shiver of dread through your chest, because if they catch you still awake, they might say you're being lazy. Or worse, suspicious. What could a servant possibly be doing at this hour except stealing or sinning? For Victorian domestic workers, insomnia wasn't just a personal torment. It was a liability, a red flag waving in the dark. It meant you might be untrustworthy, unstable, or, more often whispered than said outright, morally loose. That's right, sleepless servants, especially women, were assumed to be either criminals or masturbators. The logic was grotesquely simple. If you worked hard enough, you should be too tired to stay awake. If you weren't asleep, it meant you had energy left for temptation. And temptation, of course, always ended below the waist. This was especially true in the servant class, who lived under both surveillance and scrutiny. Middle-class Victorians didn't just fear their maids touching silverware. They feared them touching themselves. So began a quiet war, fought in the cramped bedrooms and narrow hallways of British homes, between the sleepless poor and the paranoid rich. Servants were expected to maintain not only physical order, but moral stillness. They were told when to wake, when to eat, and crucially, when to sleep. If you couldn't fall asleep on command, you were suspected of either reading novels, harboring criminal intentions, or engaging in solitary habits. Some mistresses even ordered surprise inspections after dark to ensure their maids were asleep at designated hours. Being caught awake could result in verbal humiliation, dismissal, or even medical inquiry, and that medical scrutiny was often brutal. Doctors would be called in to examine a sleepless maid and almost reflexively conclude that her insomnia stemmed from unregulated passions. Translation: she was probably masturbating. One particularly grim case, recorded in the medical diary of a rural physician, tells of a 17-year-old scullery maid dismissed after being caught in a restless state past midnight for several nights. The physician claimed she had wasting eyes and twitching fingers, a sure sign of moral compromise. She was sent to a workhouse hospital where, according to rumor, she was strapped to the bed at night to restore her modesty through physical stillness. And let's not pretend the rules applied equally. The master of the house could stay up all night drinking brandy and reading questionable French literature by candlelight without a whisper of suspicion. His son might spend entire evenings wandering brothels and still be praised for having a strong constitution. But you, the maid, the governess, the butler's assistant, you had to sleep the sleep of the innocent, or else be labeled deviant. Even dreams could betray you. There were accounts of servants muttering in their sleep, and those mutterings being interpreted as subconscious confessions. A maid who called out a man's name in a dream might be dismissed the next morning for impropriety. Here's a story that blends sex and suspicion in the most Victorian way. A young footman in a wheelchair, a state reportedly suffered from insomnia and was eventually found dead in the stables. The household insisted he'd been mentally unsound. But a friend later confessed the footman had feared being caught for visiting himself nightly, and had taken to sleeping upright to avoid temptation. Eventually, his body just gave out. Historians still debate whether it was exhaustion, self-harm, or simply the slow erosion of sleep-deprived sanity. Either way, the message was clear. Servants who disobey the sleep code do not last long, even. Worse, sleeplessness was considered contagious among staff. If one servant couldn't sleep, it might infect the whole house with restlessness. So employers enforced staggered bedtimes, curfews, and moral lectures. It wasn't about health, it was about control. One London household required all female servants to attend weekly sleep hygiene classes, which included prayer, silence drills, and the burning of immodest reading material. Another wealthy family allegedly installed small bells beneath the mattresses of their two maids. If either moved too much during the night, the bells would ring in the cook's quarters. Can you imagine sleeping with that pressure? Every toss and turn is a potential alarm. Every sigh is evidence. Every moment you're not asleep, someone's wondering what you're up to, and it's never assumed to be innocent. Fringe footnote. One particularly eccentric noblewoman in Yorkshire insisted her housemaids wear wax-sealed gloves to bed so she could check if they'd been tampered with by morning. She claimed it preserved virtue through elegant inconvenience. She also kept a log of each girl's sleeping habits, noting anxious blinking or unusual breath patterns. You might be wondering what kind of monster she was. But don't worry, her own sleeplessness eventually drove her into spiritualist seances and a brief flirtation with opium. The hypocrisy, as always, outlasted the systems that created it. Historians still argue whether the obsession with servant sleep was a byproduct of Victorian class anxiety or a more primal fear of uncontrolled bodies. The servant class, after all, was always in proximity, sharing walls, air, routines. They were physically close, but ideologically other. That contradiction brewed paranoia, especially around sex. Servants were expected to be invisible but obedient, chaste but constantly available, voiceless but faultless. If they became visibly tired, it meant they were human. And nothing was more threatening to a Victorian employer than realizing the people beneath them had the same needs, desires, and dreams. It's late now, and you can hear the master's bedroom door click shut above you. The gaslight in the hallway hums like an insect. Your body aches, but sleep still hovers just out of reach. Maybe it's hunger. Maybe it's fear. Maybe it's that your mattress is made of old coats and lumpy straw. But you don't dare complain. You lie still. You breathe. Quietly. You stare at the darkness and beg your thoughts to stop. You think of everything and nothing all at once. You try not to imagine his footsteps coming back down the stairs. You try not to imagine her unlocking the door just to check if you're dreaming sinful things. You try not to move. And in the stillness, your mind hums with electric guilt, amplified by the silence around you. Tomorrow you'll be asked how you slept. You'll smile and say, like a stone. You'll sweep ashes, scrub pots, and watch the lady of the house nibble toast without knowing your name. But you'll know her secrets because you've seen how many candles she burns past midnight. How often she stares out the window like a prisoner. Maybe she's sleepless too, but only you will be punished for it. The doctor greets you with a smile that doesn't reach his eyes. His office smells like tobacco and old wool, and his chair creaks in a way that suggests it's heard too many secrets. You sit stiffly, trying not to let your hands tremble. He takes one look at your pale face, your nervous blinking, and makes a note in his ledger. You haven't said a word yet, but he's already decided what's wrong with you. Insomnia, he says, as if naming it is enough. Likely due to overstimulation of the nervous system. Possibly excessive indulgence in solitary vices. You nod, though you don't fully understand. But you do hear the word excessive, and your stomach tightens with shame. Because you've tried everything: milk, prayer, cold water, even the weird herbal sachet your aunt gave you. Nothing helps. The nights still stretch on like dark corridors filled with whispers and flickering shadows. But today, your doctor has a solution. He lifts the corner of his desk blotter and pulls out a small velvet pouch. Inside is a device metal, polished, slightly ominous. He calls it a pelvic massage instrument. You blink. For your nerves, he explains, to stimulate the proper sleep response. And then he adds with a slow, practiced tone, we'll administer it here, in the clinic. A few times a week should be sufficient. You don't know it yet, but you've just stumbled into one of the most surreal intersections of medical history and sexual repression. The age of the therapeutic orgasm. That's not a euphemism. In late Victorian England, some physicians, especially those dealing with female patients, believed that insomnia was caused by a buildup of nervous energy, often stored conveniently in the pelvic region. The cure? Manual stimulation by a trained doctor until the patient achieved hysterical paroxysm, a polite clinical phrase for what everyone else would call an orgasm. But since women were not thought capable of sexual desire, at least not nice women, this wasn't seen as erotic, it was medicine. And in that twisted logic, the most intimate act became the most detached. The vibrator, originally developed to reduce the strain on physicians' hands, entered this world as a labor-saving device. Think about that. The earliest known consumer electric appliance wasn't a fan or a toaster, it was a vibrator, created not to bring pleasure, but to maintain the physician's efficiency. One popular model, the Granville hammer, made its debut in the 1880s and was advertised as the solution to female nervous exhaustion. It buzzed. It clicked. It came in a discreet mahogany box. It was used in hospitals and private homes. Women booked appointments weeks in advance, though they claimed it was for headaches or digestive issues. And after each session, they often reported feeling sleepy. Imagine that. Here's a sex story to give this some context. The famed courtesan Lepeva, one of the most enigmatic women of 19th century Europe, famously claimed that she never had insomnia, not because she slept peacefully, but because she never tried to sleep alone. The body knows what it needs, she once told a visitor. Sleep comes after satisfaction. Her private journals, discovered after her death, revealed that she sometimes invited her physician for late-night consultations that included massage, conversation, and something labeled only as mechanical therapy. Historians still debate whether Lepeva was complicit in the medical theater or simply using it to her advantage. Either way, she slept well. She also died in a custom-built bathtub shaped like a swan, back in the drawing rooms of more respectable households. However, this therapy was shrouded in euphemism. Women weren't told what was being done to them, only that it would calm their nerves. Some genuinely didn't know what was happening, especially the younger ones. They were told to relax, to breathe deeply, and not to ask questions. One patient, described in a doctor's casebook only as Miss L, reportedly wept with shame after her first treatment, believing she had sinned. The doctor reassured her, "You've done nothing wrong. This is simply a medical response." The fact that she returned for 3 more sessions was never commented on. Historians still argue whether these women were victims of deception or willing participants in a ritual that offered them forbidden access to their own bodies, and not all patients were female. Male insomnia also had its therapies, though they were far less pleasant. For women, stimulation was the solution. For men, the goal was suppression. One particularly cruel method was the application of cold compresses to the genitals before bed. Another involved wrapping the penis in bandages soaked in alum and vinegar. If that failed, doctors prescribed morphine or bromide salts compounds. That dulled libido but often left the user groggy and irritable. In some cases, particularly among the upper classes, Doctors recommended temporary separation from one's spouse, especially if marital expectations were believed to be exacerbating the sleeplessness. So much for conjugal comfort. Let's detour into a fringe medical trend that seems almost unbelievable now: the rise of genital tonics. These were drinks and powders advertised to restore virility and restfulness. Most were sugar, alcohol, and questionable herbs. One popular brand, the King's Respite, promised deep sleep within 30 minutes, even for those troubled by impure thoughts. It sold thousands of bottles a year until it was banned for containing trace amounts of opium and bull testicle extract. Another, called Nocturne's Blessing, claimed to calm the pelvic ether, a phrase no one could actually explain, but everyone found reassuring. The question, of course, is why all this elaborate machinery and pseudoscience was necessary in the first place. Why go to such lengths to frame natural desires as disorders, and then invent bizarre therapies to treat them? Historians suggest it's because the Victorians were stuck between two impulses: the desire for control and the fear of what they couldn't control. Sleep, like sex, is one of those things the body does without permission, and that terrified them. It made them feel helpless. So instead of accepting that helplessness, they medicalized it. They turned it into something they could track, analyze, and treat, even if the treatment involved a buzzing machine and a very confused patient. You lie back now, eyes half closed, pretending not to hear the ticking of the wall clock. The doctor turns a knob, the machine clicks to life. You focus on the ceiling, painted with water stains and the soft flicker of gaslight. You try not to feel, you try not to think. But as the device hums and your body betrays you with relief, a strange thing happens. Your mind goes quiet. Not silent, just quiet enough for sleep to slide in like a shadow through a cracked window. You drift, finally, and whether it was therapy or farce, you don't care. You're just grateful for the hush. You walk into the bedroom and feel it before you even see it, that creeping sense of being watched, judged, observed not by a person, but by the furniture. The bed stares back at you, tall and ornately carved, like a disapproving ancestor. The bedposts curl like accusing fingers. The mattress is thin and hard, the headboard polished to a shine by generations of sleepers trying not to move too much. This isn't a place for comfort, it's a place for compliance. Because in Victorian England, even your furniture had an opinion on your morality. And if you thought masturbation was a private affair, the design of your bed begged to differ. Welcome to the world of anti-masturbation furniture. Beds, chairs, and devices specifically engineered to stop your hands and thoughts from wandering in the dark. It started with books, of course. Manuals like The Secret Habits of Youth and The Perils of Onanism didn't just warn against the moral dangers of self-pleasure. They offered blueprints for how to physically prevent it. Parents were encouraged to modify their children's beds, adding bars, harnesses, or even small spikes to deter nocturnal temptation. One invention, charmingly titled the chastity frame, was a wooden contraption that sat over the blanket like a miniature canopy, preventing the sleeper from touching their own body without considerable noise and effort. Another featured a rotating cylinder beneath the mattress. If the child moved too much, it would turn and unbalance them, often spilling them onto the floor. This, apparently, was preferable to the moral decay of a midnight climax for boys. Especially, the bedroom became a surveillance zone. Parents placed bells under the sheets, locked the door from the outside, and even sewed gloves onto nightshirts. One popular modification was the guardian blanket, a quilt lined with coarse bristles that made any movement intensely uncomfortable. In one especially absurd case, a father boasted in a letter to his pastor that he'd designed a custom cot for his teenage son, featuring iron straps and a timer-locked footboard, so he couldn't uncurl his legs until morning. "He sleeps straight as a soldier," the man wrote proudly. and his complexion has returned. Here's a story that fits this moment like a lock fits a chastity key. The young Prince Leopold, Queen Victoria's youngest son, was famously delicate in health and spirit. Victoria, ever the controlling mother, worried obsessively about his habits, both public and private. According to letters later unearthed by royal biographers, his physicians were instructed to inspect his linens daily and report any signs of moral backsliding. His bed, custom built by the royal carpenter, was reportedly fitted with a raised center ridge and grooved mattress designed to keep his body posturally correct. Whether these measures were effective or simply the paranoid fantasies of a royal household terrified of scandal, historians still debate, but the idea that a teenage prince could be policed even in his dreams speaks volumes. It wasn't just royalty. Boarding schools across Britain became factories of sleeplessness, particularly for boys between the ages of 12 and 18. Institutions proudly enforced anti-masturbation regimes, often involving uncomfortable bedding, cold air drafts, and nightly inspections. At one school in Surrey, dormitory supervisors carried lanterns and notebooks, making hourly rounds to ensure no student's blanket was moving in a suspicious rhythm. If a boy was caught twice, he'd be forced to sleep in the infirmary under restraint. The third offense often led to expulsion or worse, moral correction, which might involve a public confession or the use of deterrent devices like the infamous night buckle, a leather strap looped around the groin and padlocked. Quirky. Footnote: an inventor named Edward Thorndike patented a device in 1873 called the sleeper's guard. It resembled a corset for the lower half of the body and was made of stiff linen and brass rods. It could only be unlocked by a key kept by the parent or guardian. Thorndike claimed it was ideal for boarding schools, missionary dormitories, and asylum use. It was not, as you might imagine, a bestseller, but it did gain enough notoriety that a cartoon in Punch magazine depicted a group of teenage boys marching in single file, each wearing one of the devices, their expressions grim, their legs unnaturally straight. The caption read, "Restful nights at Mr. Thorndike's School for Virtue." Meanwhile, girls were not immune to the gaze of moral furniture. Though the female body was assumed to be more passive and less inclined to self-disturbance, any deviation from expected sleep patterns raised alarms. If a girl appeared flushed in the morning or seemed unusually tired, her bedding might be inspected for signs. In extreme cases, she might be moved to a specially monitored room or have her bedroom mirror covered since reflection, according to some doctors, could stimulate vanity and thus desire. One advice book for mothers suggested placing a small religious icon above the bed to remind the maiden of heavenly eyes ever upon her. Another, less delicate text encouraged smearing vinegar on a girl's hands before bed, ensuring any nocturnal contact would result in a burning sting and, ideally, immediate repentance. Historians still argue whether these contraptions and rituals were acts of genuine concern or performative cruelty. Were Victorian parents truly convinced that sleep hygiene required physical enforcement, or were they simply terrified of losing control over something they didn't understand? The answer likely lies somewhere in the fog between fear and obsession. The idea that a child could be corrupted from within, silently and invisibly, without a single conversation or external influence, that was more terrifying than any real-world predator. So the bedroom became a battlefield, and the bed a fortress or a trap. Sex, even solitary sex, had become the ghost in the sheets, haunting every creak and shift of fabric. And because this ghost left so few tangible signs, the only thing left to scrutinize was the body itself. Pale skin, nervous energy, lack of eye contact, could be guilt, could be masturbation, could be both. One particularly damning symptom, according to multiple medical texts, was chronic sleeplessness coupled with darting thoughts, which, by Victorian logic, meant the only possible culprit was moral failure manifesting through a weak will. You weren't sick. You were disobedient. And your furniture was here to keep you in line. You lie in bed tonight, as still as possible, arms folded across your chest like a corpse, legs pressed tight to avoid any suggestion of desire. The sheets itch. The mattress groans under your tension. You want to roll over, but you don't. You want to scratch your thigh, but you don't. You think of the key to the sleeper's guard, probably sitting in your father's pocket downstairs. You try to breathe deeply. You recite the Lord's Prayer backward. You imagine cold rivers, snowfields, anything to drown the heat rising in your stomach. You ache. You twitch. You don't move. Because tonight, even the bed is watching. Wake in the middle of the night, gasping, heart rattling against your ribs like it's trying to escape. You're drenched in sweat, not from heat but from fear, primal, nonsensical, dream-born fear. The room around you is silent, but not still. The shadows on the wallpaper seem to pulse. Something moved, didn't it? A figure in the doorway? A face behind the curtain? But when you blink again, there's nothing. Just the flickering candle stub you forgot to snuff out. Its tiny flame dancing like it's laughing at you. Welcome to your Victorian nightmare, where the lines between sleep and terror are so blurred. You're never quite sure if you're awake or still trapped in the maze of your own anxious mind. And you're not alone. Thousands of Victorians recorded dreams like these, bizarre, gothic, and overwhelmingly erotic in their journals, letters, and physicians' logs. Because when you tell a whole society to repress everything, especially the body, the unconscious finds a way to shout it back louder. Especially at night. By the mid-1800s, the dream diary had become a legitimate genre. People, especially women, clergy, and the mentally ill, were encouraged to keep notebooks by their beds and document the content of their dreams. What emerged from those pages was not the serene, wholesome tapestry of innocent sleep, but a cacophony of blood, lust, floating corpses, whispering children, and men with burning eyes. A vicar's wife from Devon reported nightly dreams of being chased by cloaked men with candles for fingers. A schoolteacher confessed to recurring visions of her hands melting into puddles. Another patient, a 17-year-old boy at a London asylum, described a dream in which his bed turned into a cathedral organ, with each key connected to a nerve in his body. He claimed he woke up screaming. The asylum's physician noted, without irony, that the boy was prone to masturbation. Case closed. Victorians didn't have Freud yet, but they were already suspecting that dreams weren't just random, static. They believed the unconscious mind held secrets, perhaps even sins. Dreams were both windows into the soul and warning signals. A sexual dream was interpreted not as a healthy release, but as a sign of corruption. If you dreamed of touching someone or being touched, it wasn't romantic. It was incriminating. And if that dream left you sweaty and breathless, God help you. You might find yourself prescribed a cold compress and a lengthy confession. This obsession with dreams took on new life in Gothic literature. Authors like Sheridan Le Fanu and Mary Elizabeth Braddon mined the realm of sleep for their most terrifying imagery. Mirrors that refuse to reflect. Dead lovers crawling through windows. Entire cities made of whispers. These weren't just horror stories, they were sleep stories. And readers devoured them. Sex story time. The poet and artist Dante Gabriel Rossetti famously painted his dead wife, Elizabeth Siddal, from memory years after she overdosed on laudanum. He claimed she appeared to him in dreams, wrapped in her burial shroud, eyes open, whispering lines of poetry he hadn't yet written. His physician, alarmed by Rossetti's insomnia and increasingly erratic behavior, blamed complicated grief exacerbated by nightly autoerotic fixation. Translation: he was mourning her by pleasuring himself to the memory of her. True or not, the accusation stuck. Rossetti's dreams became suspect. He started documenting them in detail, some filled with angels, others with dripping mouths and velvet ropes. Historians still argue whether he was unraveling or simply ahead of his time. Either way, his nights were never quiet again. Even ordinary Victorians began fearing their dreams. A farmer in Kent wrote to a doctor about nightly visions of women with mouths where their eyes should be. A barrister confessed too, dreaming of his dead father, carving my chest open with a penknife and removing my guilt. These weren't just nightmares. They were seen as evidence of overindulgence, suppressed vice, or possession. One asylum kept a catalog of patient dreams, cross-referencing them with their behavior. If a patient dreamed of fire or nudity more than twice a month, it was marked as a sign of moral instability. Some families tried to purify their sleep with rituals. No meat after sunset, no reading anything fictional, sleeping with a crucifix under the pillow. One particularly popular method involved placing lavender oil on the eyelids to encourage soft feminine dreams. If that failed, doctors recommended pre-sleep visual discipline, staring at an image of the Virgin Mary or the Queen before bed. This, they claimed, would push impure thoughts out of the subconscious. Spoiler, it didn't work. Fringe tidbit time in the 1880s. A small but passionate group of British dream reformers began promoting the idea of dream fasting, a regimen of no food, no fiction, and no physical affection for 3 days to cleanse the inner cinema. One man claimed it rid him of dreams for a year. Another wrote a pamphlet titled "My Mind Now Sleeps With Me," in which he suggested dream fasting made him immune to temptation. He died of a heart attack in his sleep, clutching a dried turnip. Make of that what you will. Historians still argue whether Victorian dream culture was a form of mass repression or a quiet rebellion. After all, if your waking life was governed by rules, your dreams were the last wild frontier. And maybe that's why they scared people so much. Because they were unpredictable, unfiltered, and deeply, disturbingly honest. You couldn't lie in a dream, you couldn't hide. And when the lights went out, even the most respectable gentleman might find himself naked in a courtroom, or kissing a rival, or being chased by wolves with his mother's voice. Dreams made hypocrites of everyone. And the more society tightened its grip on daylight behavior, the more the subconscious rebelled at night. You, lying awake again, feel the echo of that rebellion. Your dreams last night were strange half memory, half fantasy. A corridor of red velvet, someone calling your name, a cold hand pulling you into a mirror. You woke with your mouth open and your legs tangled in the sheets, heart pounding, breath shallow. You tried not to think about what it meant. But now in the stillness, the images return. Not like memories, but like warnings. You wonder what your dream says about you. You wonder what a Victorian doctor would write in his little notebook if you told him. Probably self-abuse leading to cognitive disarray. Probably latent hysteria. Probably nothing that would actually help you sleep. So you don't tell anyone. You keep the dreams to yourself and let the shame swirl in silence. Because in this age, sleep isn't peace, it's a courtroom. And you're on trial every night. You're holding a glass bottle the color of old honey. Its cork half rotted, the label worn but still legible in an elegant curling script. Asterisk chlorodyne for sleep, nerves, and female complaints. Asterisk it sloshes thickly in your hand, and the smell, even from beneath the seal, is cloying, sweet, medicinal, with a hint of something deeper, darker. You hesitate. You haven't slept in 3 nights. Your thoughts are blistering at the edges. The mirror keeps catching you at strange angles. You don't know if this is the answer, but the bottle promises rest, and at this point, you'd swallow almost anything for the chance to disappear into unconsciousness. Welcome to the Victorian pharmaceutical era, where insomnia wasn't cured with sympathy or understanding, but with chemical amnesia. And you weren't just offered sleep. You were offered erasure. By the late 19th century, England's love affair with medical morality was being upstaged by its fling with pharmaceuticals. Sleep, once a thing of purity and discipline, was now something you could buy in a bottle, drizzle into a teacup, or mix into your gruel. Apothecaries did brisk business in all kinds of sleep aids, many of them containing ingredients we now reserve for emergency sedation. Opium, laudanum, morphine, chloroform, even ether. These weren't fringe treatments, they were household names. Your grandmother might have a bottle of Godfrey's cordial on her bedside table. Your father might sip Batley's sedative solution before bed. Your schoolteacher might dab a little chloroform on her handkerchief during lunch. No one asked questions. No one knew the long-term effects. They just knew it worked. For a while, let's talk about laudanum, the most famous and infamous of the lot. It was everywhere. A blend of alcohol and opium, it came in tiny glass bottles, sometimes shaped like coffins, and was marketed to everyone from infants to aristocrats. Women took it for cramps. Men took it for melancholy. Writers took it for inspiration. And the sleepless? They clung to it like a lifeboat. But laudanum didn't provide real rest. It knocked you out. It smothered your thoughts in a warm, golden fog, wrapped your brain in cotton, and dropped you into a black pit of half-dreams and false peace. You woke up feeling brittle, slow, sometimes even more exhausted. But at least you woke. And that felt like enough. Here's a sex story soaked in ether. The French author and diplomat Paul Verlaine, who spent much of his adult life oscillating between romantic scandal and religious guilt, suffered from chronic insomnia. He once described lying in bed for hours, haunted by visions of naked priests and weeping angels. His doctor prescribed a nightly ritual, a glass of absinthe chased by a cloth soaked in ether, held gently over the face until he lost consciousness. Verlaine called it descending through green fog into velvet, and swore it was the only way he could avoid dreams. Of course, he also described waking up to find he'd scratched words into the walls with a fork and, on one occasion, kissed the foot of a statue in his garden. Historians still argue whether his sleep was real, or just another performance. Back in England, doctors were becoming quietly addicted to their own prescriptions. One London physician, Dr. Henry Biddlecombe, was known for prescribing laudanum to patients suffering from nocturnal unrest. When asked if he used it himself, he laughed. "I wouldn't dare sleep without it," he said. He died at his desk in 1886, surrounded by empty bottles and a half-finished letter to a patient warning of the dangers of dependency. Irony, it seems, has always been fatal. For the average Victorian, sleep became a transaction. You didn't earn it through virtue anymore, you bought it. And the moment that transaction began, so did the consequences. The drugs worked, but they dulled everything. Emotions, thoughts, sensation. Users reported waking up in pools of sweat, forgetting entire days, or losing time during conversations. But no one really wanted to stop. Because stopping meant facing the insomnia again. And the insomnia, as we've seen, was never just about sleep. It was about guilt, about control, about secrets. Fringe fact: a popular late Victorian children's syrup called Soothing Baby's Tonic contained morphine, alcohol, and powdered opium. It was used liberally to help babies sleep. It also killed an alarming number of infants, though those deaths were often chalked up to infantile weakness or divine will. The label featured a cherubic baby smiling peacefully beneath the phrase, "Angels rest best." Dark doesn't even begin to cover it. Historians still argue whether the pharmaceutical boom was a liberation or another form of control. On one hand, these drugs gave people, especially women, an escape from the suffocating expectations of their lives. A way to slip out of the corset of consciousness and into something softer, quieter. But on the other hand, the use of these Substances often reinforce the idea that your suffering was your fault, and that you needed to be fixed, pacified, silenced. Your sleeplessness wasn't a signal that something was wrong with the world. It was proof that something was wrong with you. Take this bottle, and hush. There were dissenters, of course. A few doctors began to warn against over-medicating. A pamphlet titled "Dreams Stolen by the Bottle" made the rounds in 1889, warning that laudanum erases not only pain, but personality. But it was too little, too late. By then, even Queen Victoria's own physician had admitted to keeping a small vial of chloroform on his nightstand. For emergencies, he claimed. Though one of his assistants later noted that the vial was replaced weekly. You lie in bed, now bottle in hand. You unscrew the cork and sniff. It's sharp, sweet, with that unmistakable undertone of something not quite right. You think of all the people who've swallowed this before you. The poets, the widows, the maids, and the kings. You think of your own mind, fraying at the edges, and wonder if sleep without dreams is still sleep. You wonder if silence earned through chemistry is still peace, but you drink anyway. Because it's late, because your thoughts are too loud, because you're tired of being tired. The liquid burns a little, your tongue goes numb, your fingers feel distant. And then, slowly, the world slips away, not into rest, exactly, but into absence. A velvet curtain falls over your thoughts. You don't sleep. You vanish. It starts with a whisper behind closed doors. A boy wakes up too many times, drenched in sweat, shaking, with sheets that need to be washed more often than the others. A physician is called, discreetly. He examines the boy, asks questions no one wants to answer, and eventually turns to the parents with a calm, professional suggestion: circumcision. Not for religious reasons, not for hygiene, but to prevent masturbation. Because in late Victorian England, if you were sleepless, twitchy, pale, or simply too introspective, the scalpel might be coming for you. And the justification would be medicine, or morality, or both. Strap in tonight. We enter the most absurdly brutal chapter in the long war between sleep, shame, and sexuality. By the 1880s, circumcision had become a legitimate medical solution to a problem that doctors could not otherwise explain. Why were young boys touching themselves at night and then complaining of fatigue, anxiety, or insomnia during the day? It wasn't framed as pleasure, it was pathology. The prevailing theory, pushed by influential voices like Dr. Peter Charles Remendino, was that the foreskin harbored nerve endings that created irritation and excitability, leading to compulsive self-abuse and consequently mental and physical decline. Remove the foreskin, they argued, and you remove the temptation. You restore sleep. You purify the soul. And just like that, a whole generation of boys were being led into operating rooms, not because they were ill, but because they were too human. The procedure was often performed without anesthetic, especially on children. Pain, after all, was part of the moral equation. If you suffered enough, you'd remember not to sin again. One diary entry, written by a 14-year-old boy in Manchester, recounts how he was taken to the family doctor, made to lie down, and cut for my wickedness. He described the pain as blinding, but said he was most ashamed of crying in front of his father. That same father later recorded in a letter to his brother, "I believe it saved his soul. He sleeps now like an angel." No mention of trauma. No mention of consent. Sex story break. Though not the kind you expect. The French writer Guy de Maupassant, who suffered from insomnia and obsessive fears about the body's rebellion, once underwent a self-imposed chastity period during which he slept tied in a seated position, arms restrained. He kept a razor near his bed in case of emergency weakness. In one letter he wrote, "If I cut it off, will my mind return to me?" Historians aren't sure how literal he was, but the desperation was real. He died mad. Some blamed syphilis. Others blamed suppressed desire turned inward like a dagger. Meanwhile, English physicians were exporting circumcision to the colonies, promoting it as a civilizing tool for native populations. The logic was that primitive peoples were less capable of self-restraint, and thus needed surgical correction. Yes, really. Sleep was once again used as the metric. If a patient, native or British, reported restless nights, masturbation was suspected, and circumcision was prescribed not just as a solution, but as a preventative. Newborns were sometimes circumcised on day 1 to ensure a morally sound future. The idea that an infant could be preemptively punished for something they hadn't done yet is so Victorian it hurts. Fringe tidbit time. One eccentric doctor, Sir Lionel Tetherton, claimed he could diagnose potential masturbators by the shape of their earlobes and the curvature of their spines. He designed a special cot with metal cuffs that locked the wrists at night, and a groin sensor that emitted a small electric shock if unacceptable contact was detected. When asked what the purpose of the shock was, he replied, "To associate. Sign with fire, as in the scripture." He later patented a children's prayer book that doubled as a sedative when pressed to the forehead. Sales were minimal. Historians still argue whether circumcision became so widespread due to genuine medical belief or simply because it offered an easy, irreversible solution to an imagined problem. Once it became fashionable among the upper classes, it spread rapidly, supported by doctors who either believed in it or didn't want to appear behind the times. It was modern, it was neat, it required no conversation. Parents could simply say, "It's for his sleep," and be done with it. Boys had no say. And if they still suffered from insomnia afterward, the fault wasn't the surgery, it was their character. Let's pause and reflect on what that means. You're 11 years old. You have trouble sleeping. You fidget. You're curious about your body. And one day, someone with cold hands and sharper tools tells you that your body is the reason you're not sleeping. That part of you must be taken away to make you whole. No wonder so many grew up confused, ashamed, and terrified of intimacy. Sleep was never just about rest, it was about punishment deferred, through mutilation if necessary. Girls weren't completely spared either. While circumcision didn't apply, clitoridectomy was occasionally performed on girls deemed overly excitable, particularly in asylum settings. If a girl cried too often, read too much, or was caught rubbing her thighs together, she might be referred for genital correction. These procedures were often done under the guise of calming hysteria or improving sleep quality. One doctor wrote, "A quiet girl is a restful girl." As if silence was the goal, not understanding. You lie awake tonight, stomach curled around. A dull ache, wondering if something in you is broken or if something was taken from you. You try not to think about the stories you've heard. The boys who went to sleep with themselves whole and woke up less. The girls who stopped reading because it made their dreams too colorful. The parents who said they did it out of love. The doctors who called it progress. You press your knees together, not from arousal, but from fear. You try to remember how it felt to sleep without shame. But the memory won't come. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters. Somewhere down the hall, someone coughs. You blink at the ceiling and whisper a prayer you're not sure you believe in anymore. Not for healing, not for forgiveness, just for sleep. Honest, dreamless, body-safe sleep. You step out into the night because your bed has betrayed you. Again, the sheets cling like cobwebs. The pillow feels stuffed with thistles, and the silence inside your room is louder than anything the city could throw at you. So you wrap your coat around your shoulders, strike a match for your lantern, and slip through the front door like a ghost. It's nearly 2 in the morning. London is breathing in slow, ragged gasps. The street lamps burn like tired eyes. The air tastes of soot and damp stone. This, you think, is what insomnia looks like in the open cobblestone slick with fog. Alley cats prowling between barrels, and strange figures moving through the dark with the careful grace of those used to not being seen. Welcome to the secret world of the Victorian nightwalkers, not prostitutes, not quite criminals, but the wanderers, the watchers, the insomniacs who turned their sleeplessness into an unspoken brotherhood of shadows. By the 1870s, sleeplessness wasn't just a private affliction, it had become a visible phenomenon. Nighttime London had its own population, its own rituals. Gaslight softened the corners of buildings. Policemen on the graveyard shift patrolled with lanterns that swung like pendulums. Bakery workers rose before the sun to stoke fires. Drunks sang lullabies in slurred French. But there were others out too, people who didn't belong to the trades, who weren't paid to be awake. Just ordinary citizens who could not or would not sleep. Poets, widowers, librarians, schoolgirls with notebooks hidden in their sleeves. They walked not with purpose, but with longing. Some hoped the motion would lull their bodies into exhaustion. Others hoped the streets would distract them from the deeper ache inside. All of them were searching for something that no physician could prescribe: stillness. Let's talk about one of the most famous of these nightwalkers, Charles Dickens. Yes, that Dickens. The man who gave us Orphan Boys and Miserly Redemption was a notorious insomniac. He walked miles through London's sleeping streets, often accompanied only by a notebook and a cane. He claimed that only walking could unclench the mind and shake loose the anxieties of a day. His nighttime journeys took him through slums, cemeteries, docks, and theaters long after the curtains fell. Sometimes he stopped to speak with beggars or to jot down overheard snippets of street conversation. Other times he simply stared at windows, wondering about the people asleep inside. He once wrote, "There are ghosts in the city at night, and some of them are made of flesh." Historians believe some of his most vivid scenes were born during these walks, not in the comfort of his study, but in the wet hush of fog-bound alleys. But not all nightwalkers were literary giants. Some were tailors with too much caffeine in their blood. Some were housemaids who couldn't risk being caught fidgeting in bed. One particularly curious figure was Mrs. Eugenia Harrow, a retired midwife who suffered from what she called the midnight quivers. Rather than lie awake, she'd don a bonnet and walk the circumference of Regent's Park twice. She recorded these walks in a small diary, noting the faces she passed, the cats she counted, and the occasional gentleman of questionable purpose. She never claimed to enjoy the walks. "It is not a pleasure," she wrote, "but a condition. I must move or I vanish." The diary, now housed in a tiny museum in Sussex, reads like a symphony of quiet despair etched in careful spidery ink. Fringe tidbit: London actually employed official night watchmen, mostly older men, often veterans who patrolled the streets between midnight and dawn. They carried staffs, rattles, and lanterns, and were meant to prevent crime. But more often than not, they ended up becoming impromptu therapists for the sleepless. One such man, Archibald Rattle Jones, was known for offering peppermint, lozenges, and unsolicited advice to any passerby. "You got ghosts?" he'd ask. "Walk faster than them." He kept a personal ledger of the regulars he saw each week, including a pale young woman he referred to as the Wraith with Gloves. Her name, age, or story were never recorded, just her presence. Just that she kept coming back. Sex. Story pause, because of course even the nocturnal had their rituals. One scandalous letter in the erotic spirit through history describes an affair between a wealthy merchant's wife and a lamplighter. She, an insomniac. He, a worker on the 2 a.m. route. Their trysts took place in alleyways and under gas lamps as he paused to light the next post. She called it making love in rhythm with the city's glow. They were discovered when she wrote a poem about it and accidentally mailed it to her husband instead of her friend. Divorce followed. The lamplighter was reassigned to a different district, but the poem survived. And it's terrible but oddly sweet. Historians still argue whether the rise of urban insomnia created a new kind of social class, the sleepless citizen. These weren't beggars or vagrants, but respectable people who found themselves out of sync with the rigid rhythms of Victorian life. For them, the night became a kind of refuge, half exile, half sanctuary. And yet, even in that refuge, they were judged. A woman caught walking alone after midnight could be assumed a prostitute. A man seen too often outside might be accused of madness or melancholy. Insomnia became suspicious behavior, not just a private malady. One newspaper warned that those who wander after dark seek either sin or shadows. Both are dangerous. Let's not forget the role of the police. In many parts of the city, night walking without a stated purpose could get you questioned or arrested. Some insomniacs took to carrying sleep notes from their doctors, proving that they were under medical orders to walk at night. Imagine that, having to explain your insomnia like a license. I can't sleep, so I walk wasn't enough. You needed papers. Just like a vagrant. Just like a threat. And yet, for many, these night walks were the only moments of clarity they had. The city asleep was kinder than the city awake. It didn't expect anything. It didn't measure your productivity or track your dreams. It just existed. You could breathe in the soft stink of coal smoke, listen to the murmurs of the river, feel the cobblestones under your feet, and know, if only for a while, that you were not alone. That others somewhere were walking too. You tonight slip. Out quietly, boots crunching softly. The cold bites at your cheeks. A drunk stumbles past you humming. A newspaper boy sleeps in the doorway of a butcher's shop. You pass under a gaslight and feel the warmth of it on your face, like a tiny artificial sun made just for you. You walk, not toward anything, not away from anything, but simply because stillness is impossible. Because sometimes, the city is the only thing that understands. Because sleep is a locked door, and tonight, the street is the only key you've got. The hallway smells like boiled cabbage and formaldehyde. The gaslights flicker, casting long shadows on the floor shadows that make the linoleum look like it's cracking open. You're not in a prison, not technically, but everything about this building whispers confinement. The locked doors, the quiet sobs, the slippers that shuffle like ghosts on night watch. You've come to visit your sister or your cousin or your wife, depending on who you tell the story to, and she's been here for 3 weeks now. Admitted for nervous restlessness and nocturnal agitation. The diagnosis? Female. Hysteria. The prescription? Silence, supervision, and sleep. Because in Victorian England, a woman's insomnia wasn't just her problem, it was the family's shame, the husband's burden, and ultimately, the asylum's concern. Let's not sugarcoat it. Women who couldn't sleep in the 19th century were often declared insane. Not because they were violent or irrational, or even incoherent, but because they disturbed the fragile ecosystem of domestic tranquility. A wife who wandered the halls at night, who spoke of invisible anxieties or wept into her nightgown until dawn, was not seen as someone in need of support. She was seen as a threat to order. The husband, bewildered and embarrassed, would call in a physician. The physician, trained to treat deviation as disorder, would find no physical illness but plenty of symptoms that suggested moral instability, sleeplessness, irritability, overactive imagination. And once a woman was labeled hysterical, institutionalization was just one more step on the staircase of control. Take the case of Mrs. E, a real patient whose asylum notes survive in a private archive. A mother of 2, she began waking at 3 a.m. every night, pacing the kitchen, cleaning already clean dishes. Her husband, a solicitor, complained that her restlessness was unsettling the children and interfering with my own sleep. A doctor was called. He recorded that the patient suffers from a dreamlike waking state, is obsessed with unseen threats, and is resistant to rest. Within a week, she was placed in a rest home, which is a polite term for a soft asylum. Her room was whitewashed, her windows barred, her bed bolted to the floor. Her only allowed book was the Bible. She was given bromide salts to still her passions, and her husband visited once a month. She wrote letters daily. None were mailed. Now, let's be very clear. Not all Victorian women were carted off for sleeplessness. Many managed their restlessness through socially acceptable outlets: needlework, opium, silent prayer. But for those without means, or those married to impatient men, or those who simply spoke too often about how exhausted they were, the options narrowed quickly. Because unlike men, whose insomnia was often seen as the consequence of intellectual overwork, a woman's insomnia was almost always interpreted as emotional overindulgence. If a man couldn't sleep, it was his ambition. If a woman couldn't sleep, it was her uterus. Fringe belief of the time. Some doctors genuinely thought the uterus could wander within the body and cause psychological symptoms, hence the term hysteria, from the Greek for womb. One treatment involved strapping the abdomen with warm flannel. Another was inserting leeches to draw off congestion. And yet, somehow the leeches didn't help women sleep better. Strange that. Sex story interlude, or rather, institutionalized sexuality. In one notorious asylum outside of Bristol, a nurse was dismissed after it was discovered she'd been providing stimulation to several female patients who couldn't sleep. Her defenders claimed she was only doing what the doctors wouldn't, helping the women relax through intimate attention. Her accusers said she was exploiting them. The court couldn't agree. She disappeared into obscurity. But whispers of her lingered among the staff. One orderly referred to her as the midnight cure. It was meant as a joke. It wasn't funny. Historians still argue whether these rest homes were more harmful than helpful. Some women reported feeling safe there, away from the demands of family, the pressure of performing domestic perfection. Others never recovered from the experience. The isolation, the constant surveillance, the chemical sedation, it chipped away at them until their sense of self was as gray as the walls. And let's not forget, many women entered these institutions against their will. A husband, brother, or even adult son could sign the papers. The patient's testimony meant almost nothing, especially if she was tired. And that's the cruel irony. Insomnia, in women, was framed as both cause and symptom. You couldn't sleep because you were unstable, and your instability was proven by your sleeplessness. It was a loop, a trap, a medical Mobius strip. And the only way out, often, was through surrender. You stopped talking. You stopped pacing. You stared out the window and nodded when spoken to. And eventually, they might let you go. Back to a home that hadn't changed. Back to a bed that still felt like a cell. One physician, in a letter now displayed in the Museum of the Mind, wrote this about a patient. Her restlessness is not born of madness, but of a spirit too large for the quiet she is forced to keep. She does not need treatment. She needs freedom. The letter was never sent. The patient remained institutionalized for 5 more years. You sit on the edge of the bed now, in that narrow institutional cot, the sheets starched to near paper-cut sharpness. You're not sure if you're the patient or just imagining her, but you feel her breath in the dark. You hear the rustle of the nurse's skirts, the faint clink of a key turning in the lock. You've stopped counting the nights. You've stopped asking for more blankets. You whisper your thoughts into the mattress just to feel them escape. You are not hysterical. You are just awake. But in this place, there is no difference. Your bedroom glows faintly, not from moonlight, but from something artificial, a soft, humming yellow that leaks in through the curtain edges and outlines your furniture like a crime scene. It's gaslight. Still novel, still thrilling, and very much the reason your eyes refuse to close. Outside, the lamplighters are finishing their rounds, clicking their poles against the lamps with practiced rhythm. The city doesn't go dark anymore. Not fully. And neither do you. Because something's changing, not just in your sleep, but in your skin, your mind, your impulses. Your thoughts wander more at night now, down avenues they never used to. And your hands? They follow. Masturbation, once the hidden villain of the restless, is now dancing hand in hand with another force, modernity. The Victorians were obsessed with innovation, and terrified by what it might awaken. Electricity, typewriters, trains, telegraphs, every new technology promised order, speed, and control. But it also brought noise, light, constant stimulation. The day stretched longer. The night shrank. Suddenly, the hours once reserved for dreams and moral contemplation were filled with movement, color, and heat. Medical journals began to note an increase in urban nervous exhaustion, especially among young men. The usual scapegoat was masturbation. But now it wasn't just the act, it was the act amplified by the modern world. More mirrors, more illustrations, more private bedrooms, more excuses. Let's talk about pornography, not the kind you're imagining, not yet, but the Victorian version. Cheap lithographs, risk novels, anatomical diagrams that somehow lingered too long on certain curves. The printing press, turbocharged by capitalism and a steady demand for scandal, made erotic materials more available than ever before, and people were buying a lot. Even those who claimed they weren't. The infamous obscene publications. Act of 1857 tried to stem the tide. But like most things in the Victorian moral arsenal, it only made people want it more. One judge reportedly confiscated a stash of erotic pamphlets, then quietly took several home for review. And it wasn't just men. Women, too, began accessing this new tide of imagery, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose. One governess was dismissed after being caught tracing a Greek statue from an encyclopedia by candlelight. Her cheeks flushed, her sketchbook suspiciously wrinkled. She claimed it was for artistic study. Her employer claimed it was a matter for the vicar. Her physician, called in to assess her nervous state, warned that exposure to suggestive material can stimulate the libido beyond the body's ability to regulate. His prescription, valerian, a diet of turnips, and fewer books. Sex. Story break. The painter Edward Lear, yes. The one who wrote nonsense poems was known to suffer from insomnia and described a compulsion to draw suggestive forms into the night. In a private sketchbook, never published in his lifetime, he doodled figures mid-embrace, usually in the margins of architectural studies or bird illustrations. His letters mention nights of sleeplessness, accompanied by images which refuse to leave the mind's stage. He once tried to subdue these visions with absinthe and clove oil. He did not succeed. Historians still debate whether Lear's insomnia was caused by sexual repression or simply by the loneliness of a mind that never quieted. Back in the drawing rooms of respectable society, new gadgets promised to help manage the tension. The electric belt, for instance, was marketed as both a fitness aid and a moral stabilizer. It wrapped around the waist and delivered mild shocks to invigorate the nerves and discourage lower impulses. Some models featured a crotch attachment. One advertisement claimed, ideal for students, clerks, and other self-improvers. Sales were brisk and painful. The real revolution, though, was the gas lamp. With streets and homes lit longer and brighter, bedtime became elastic. There was no natural cue to wind down. Children stayed up reading. Adults stayed up worrying. And between those quiet, liminal hours, too late to be productive, too early to sleep, the urge to self-soothe surged. Doctors began to warn that gaslight had a libidinal effect, stimulating the body in unnatural ways. One theory suggested that the gentle flicker of a flame mimicked the movement of arousal and could inspire impure thoughts in the sensitive mind. So yes, at one point, the lighting was blamed for your private life. Fringe invention. The somnia screen, a window covering made of thick black cloth and blessed by an Anglican priest. Marketed as a moral sleep aid, it claimed to block not just light but temptation. Testimonials poured in. I stopped reading French novels after installing the somnia screen. My son no longer talks to himself at night. Our maid has grown duller, but sleeps longer. The product line failed after rats began nesting in the folds. Historians still argue whether the Victorian explosion of stimulation, visual, mechanical, electrical, was the cause of their insomnia or simply a mirror held up to it. Did modernity disrupt natural rhythms, or did it merely expose how fragile those rhythms always were? Maybe both. Because once the lights came on, you couldn't pretend you didn't see. The bedroom, once a sanctuary, became a theater. And you? You became both audience and performer. Tonight, as you lie awake, the glow from outside won't let go. The gaslight outlines the shape of your dresser, your feet, your thoughts. You tried turning away. You tried covering your eyes. But something hums under your skin. Not desire, exactly, but its cousin. That restless curiosity. That low, buzzing urge to touch, to look, to feel. You remember the lithograph you saw earlier in the day, tucked behind a chemistry book at the lending library. A pose too elegant for science. You didn't take it home. But your mind did. You slide deeper into the sheets. You scold your hands. You recite a prayer half remembered from school, but the light doesn't care. It seeps through the curtain edge, soft and golden, refusing to blink. You tell yourself this is normal. Everyone struggles now and then. It's just the city. It's just the progress. It's just your nerves. But somewhere beneath all that, it's not the gaslight keeping you up. It's what the gaslight makes visible. He lights a cigar, not because he's calm, but because he wants to appear calm. The smoke curls slowly, as though it knows it's performing. Across the room, you sit on the edge of a fainting couch, hands folded, trying to explain a dream that won't stop replaying. You're walking through a tunnel. There's velvet on the walls. You hear your mother calling your name, but when you turn, she has no face. You wake up gasping, clutching your thighs, ashamed. The man with the cigar nods solemnly. "Tell me," he says, "how often do you think about your mother?" Welcome to the beginning of something new and deeply strange. The moment Victorian insomnia collides with psychoanalysis. The moment dreams stop being punishable offenses and start being puzzles. And the moment guilt, instead of being shaved off with scalpels and straps, is coaxed gently into the light, with velvet gloves and soft questions that always seem to come back to sex. Freud wasn't the only thinker poking around in the bedsheets of the sleepless, but he was definitely the most notorious. By the 1890s, as insomnia swept through the drawing rooms and dormitories of Europe, Freud began asking why. Not just why people couldn't sleep, but what kept them awake beneath the surface. The old explanations, nerves, masturbation, indigestion, impure literature, no longer satisfied him. He believed the answer lay deeper. That sleep was a fragile structure built on the foundations of the unconscious. And that when those foundations cracked due to repressed desires, unspoken fears, unresolved conflicts, sleep collapsed like a poorly built house. The night became a battleground between the superego and the ID, and the pillow became a stage. Let's dive into one of Freud's more unsettling claims, that the root of many sleep disorders was unresolved Oedipal tension. Yes, the whole "you secretly desire your mother" thing. In his case studies, Freud often linked insomnia to dream content involving family, particularly parental figures. A boy who dreamed of drowning? Fear of paternal punishment. A girl who couldn't fall asleep without hugging a doll named Father? Obvious. Even seemingly innocent dreams of falling, of flying, of being chased were to Freud metaphors for suppressed sexual energy. The eroticism wasn't in the content, it was in the avoidance, sex story. Oh yes. Anna O., the pseudonymous patient of Freud's colleague, Joseph Breuer, was the original case study for what would become psychoanalytic therapy. She suffered from hysterical insomnia, night terrors, paralysis, and language loss. Breuer discovered that simply talking to her about dreams, about childhood, about feelings seemed to alleviate her symptoms. They called it the talking cure. But here's the twist. Breuer ended the treatment abruptly when Anna developed what they called transference, an emotional, possibly romantic attachment to her doctor. It scared him. He ran. She relapsed. Historians still argue whether Anna was cured, betrayed, or both. But her story became the seed from which Freud's whole empire of subconscious architecture grew, and it wasn't just about dreams. Freud believed that the very act of struggling to fall asleep could be symptomatic of repression. The body wanted to rest, the mind didn't. Why? Because the mind knew that sleep opened the gates. And once dreams began, the truth would slip out. Maybe in symbols. Maybe in screams. Maybe in a dream about a train tunnel that made you wake up clenching your fists and biting your lip. Sleep was no longer sanctuary, it was interrogation. This shift, from physical to psychological explanation, terrified traditional Victorian physicians. They had built careers on moral instruction and surgical restraint. The idea that sleeplessness wasn't a sin, but a symptom of emotional trauma, or buried lust, or grief that made them irrelevant. So they fought back. They dismissed Freud as obscene, indulgent, anti-English. One critic wrote, "Let the Viennese keep their mother fantasies. We prefer cold baths and discipline." Yet quietly, many of these same doctors began incorporating his methods. They asked more questions. They listened longer. They bought his books, even if they didn't admit it. Fringe observation. Freud reportedly had his own peculiar sleep habits. He believed that one should never eat heavy meals before bed or sleep in total silence. He preferred a ticking clock, saying it helped anchor the mind. He also insisted on keeping a notepad by his bed in case inspiration struck in the middle of the night. Several of his early dream theories were scribbled at 3 a.m., including the now famous phrase, "Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar." But also sometimes it isn't. Psychoanalysis changed the narrative. Instead of asking what you'd done wrong during the day, it asked what you were refusing to feel during the night. Instead of blaming the mattress or the lighting or the wallpaper, it pointed inward to shame, to loss, to childhood memories you didn't realize were still leaking through your bones. And while this approach wasn't necessarily gentler, it could be invasive, obsessive, self-absorbed. It was different. It gave the sleepless a new vocabulary. Not just nervous or weak or impure, but fragmented, repressed, wounded. Terms that suggested the possibility of repair. Still, historians argue whether psychoanalysis was revolutionary or simply another form of control dressed in velvet. After all, it still pathologized deviation. It still blamed the patient, just more politely. And it introduced new anxieties. Am I dreaming the wrong dreams? Am I secretly in love with the wrong person? Is my inability to sleep proof that I'm resisting healing? Or worse, enjoying the suffering? Tonight, you lie in bed and try not to think about your parents. But of course you do. Not directly. Just the scent of your mother's perfume. The way your father's boots sounded on the stairs. The shape of your childhood house in a dream you keep having where all the doors are locked. You try not to name it, but it's there. You twist in the sheets. You stare at the ceiling. You wonder what Freud would say. Probably something irritating and smug. Probably something uncomfortably true. Eventually, you close your eyes, not because you're at peace, but because you've accepted the war will be fought there now. In dreams, in symbols, in a flickering image of a staircase that leads nowhere and everywhere at once. And maybe, just maybe, you'll sleep. Not because you've outrun the truth, but because you've finally decided to let it follow you. You sit upright at 4:07 a.m., not with a gasp or a jolt, but with the practiced grace of someone whose body has learned that rest is optional. You don't panic anymore. You reach for the lamp, you light it. You exhale like it's a ritual, because it is. This is not a moment of despair, it's the start of your second shift. Because by the end of the 19th century, insomnia isn't just a crisis, it's a career, it's a lifestyle. It's a mark of being modern. Welcome to the era where sleeplessness goes from being a shameful symptom to a symbol of productivity, sophistication, and sometimes genius. By 1895, something strange had happened. The very same upper and middle classes that once fretted over masturbation and melancholy began to flirt with insomnia. Not out of necessity, but as a mark of distinction. The world was changing faster than ever. Telephones, electric light, telegrams about telephones. And in this whirlwind of innovation, being awake became a kind of currency. Sleep was for the lazy, the idle, the unambitious. The new hero was the man who could function on 3 hours of rest and still run a bank, write a pamphlet, and win a fencing duel before breakfast. I'd enter the productive insomniac. Newspapers glorified them. Magazines profiled them. There were entire essays devoted to figures like Edison, who famously claimed he only needed 4 hours of sleep, and Winston Churchill, who insisted that strategic napping between all-nighters was the key to leadership. The sleepless man was no longer a sinner or a sufferer, he was a visionary. A titan, a machine. The implication was clear. If you were still sleeping 8 hours a night, you weren't working hard enough, or thinking fast enough, or mattering very much at all. And the trend didn't stop with men. Women, too, began to rebrand their restlessness. Society hostesses bragged about planning 3-day events on 2 hours of sleep. Actresses claimed they wrote entire memoirs between midnight and dawn. One popular beauty magazine published a column titled "The Night-Faced Woman," suggesting that true elegance came from the quiet solitude of sleepless hours, during which one could apply creams, recite poetry, and reflect deeply while the world dozed like fools. Let's not pretend this was healthy. It was performative and exhausting. But for many Victorians, it felt preferable to being pathologized. Better to be admired for your insomnia than institutionalized for it. And so people adapted. They created routines around their sleeplessness. They lit more lamps. They drank more coffee. They wore dark silk dressing gowns and referred to themselves as crepuscular thinkers. They began to see insomnia not as a problem to solve, but as a space to occupy. The night became a new social class, and to belong to it meant something. Sex story. Pause. George Sand, the French novelist and all-night letter writer, famously claimed she wrote best between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. She hosted nocturnal salons where artists, poets, and lovers passed brandy and arguments until the gaslights dimmed. One attendee recalled lying with her on a divan while debating whether sleeplessness was a sign of genius or heartbreak. She replied, "What's the difference?" Her love affairs, both scandalous and tender, often unfolded in the dead of night, proof that insomnia wasn't always lonely. Sometimes it was an invitation. In England, the commodification of sleeplessness exploded. New products promised to help you harness the night. Midnight tea blends with names like Lucid Fog and Moonlight Steel. Stationery designed for late-night letter writing, scented with lavender and printed with quotes from Byron. Even insomnia-themed clothing, loose robes marketed as thinking garments, with deeper pockets for pens and opium flasks. One particularly surreal invention was the sleepless scholar's desk, a mahogany contraption that could convert from a reading table to a bed with a single pull of a lever. It was billed as ideal for the restless mind. But underneath this trend of glamorized fatigue, the old fears still smoldered. Because even as sleeplessness became fashionable, it remained unpredictable. There was still the danger that it might slip from elegant to erratic, from inspiring to unhinged. The same man praised for burning the midnight oil could be pitied or institutionalized if he started hearing voices. The same woman applauded for writing poetry at dawn could be condemned if her verses became too raw, too honest. Victorian society was comfortable with insomnia only when it could be aestheticized, packaged, and sold. The moment it got messy, it reverted to being a symptom again. Fringe trivia. A short-lived club in Soho called The Night Society advertised itself as a gathering place for insomniacs, intellectuals, and voluntary vampires. Members wore velvet sashes and signed a pledge to keep the watch when others sleep. It closed within a year after a scandal involving absinthe, a collapsed chandelier, and a man who claimed to be the reincarnation of Nero. No one was injured. But the Times ran an editorial titled, "What Are We Without Sleep?" Historians still argue whether this late Victorian celebration of sleeplessness was a genuine cultural shift or just another mask for deeper dysfunction. Were people truly proud of their insomnia or just terrified of what would happen if they stopped moving long enough to feel the truth? Whatever the case, the result was a paradox. A society that punished sleeplessness as pathology in some, while rewarding it as genius in others. A society where a factory girl who couldn't sleep might be blamed for moral decay, while a banker who did the same might be knighted for his relentless drive. Tonight, you light your lamp without shame. You have a stack of letters to read, a diary to update, a shelf to dust, a thought to chase into the dark. You sip something hot and bitter, not to lull yourself, but to sharpen the edge. You know you'll feel it in the morning. The ache behind the eyes, the dizziness, the slight nausea. But tonight, that doesn't matter. Tonight, your insomnia isn't a burden, it's a badge. You wear it like silk. You speak softly because the world is sleeping. But your mind? It's wide awake, dressed for work, and already 2 hours into tomorrow. You wake up with ink on your fingers and a candle, stub burning dangerously low. The last thing you remember is writing down a sentence that felt important, urgent, something about a mirror and a wound that won't close. But now the words are smudged, your mouth tastes like dust, and outside, the sky is bleeding pale. You didn't sleep, not really. Just drifted through thoughts so dense they stuck to your skin. And yet, there's a strange satisfaction in the exhaustion, a pride, even. Because in this final stretch of the century, being sleep-deprived doesn't just make you eccentric. It makes you meaningful. And that's the last, most seductive lie the Victorian era whispered in the ear of the sleepless. If you suffer long enough, it must be for something. The mythology of insomnia had fully matured. It was no longer just an affliction of the sinful, the sick, or the nervous. It had become spiritual, existential, poetic. The Romantic poets had planted the seeds. But by the 1890s, sleeplessness was blooming into a full-blown aesthetic. Writers, painters, and philosophers began to frame insomnia not as a medical condition, but as a kind of initiation, right, a dark gift that gave access to deeper truths. To sleep, they claimed, was to surrender to ignorance. But to lie awake, eyes wide open through the dead hours, was to see the world as it truly was. Hollow, fragile, sublime. Let's take Algernon Charles Swinburne again, not just as a poet, but as a poster child for exquisite unrest. He once declared, "I am most alive in the hour when the sky forgets its name." He described his insomnia as a chorus of nerves conducted by ghosts, and believed it was the source of his genius. His friends worried. He didn't care. He slept in bursts, 10 minutes here, 20 there, then spent the rest of his time scribbling mad fragments and dipping his fingers in red ink to simulate bleeding. He believed dreams were a bourgeois distraction. Waking nightmares were the real art. It wasn't just men. Women, too, found in insomnia a space where they could exist outside their roles. The writer Vernon Lee, often photographed in dark velvet, with a cigarette and a stare that could split wallpaper, said she wrote best when she hadn't slept in days. Her essays on aesthetics and ghosts read like fever dreams, intense, lyrical, unsettling. Critics accused her of being too emotional. She replied, "Only those who have walked the long hours of night understand the shape of silence." That line, incidentally, was quoted at her funeral. Carved into stone, this transformation from shame to sacredness was intoxicating. Suddenly, artists were expected to be insomniacs. A well-rested writer was suspect. A painter who slept 8 hours was considered unserious. Young bohemians began cultivating sleeplessness the way others cultivated facial hair or radical politics. They drank bitter coffee, smoked long black cigarettes, quoted Nietzsche until dawn. Sleep was a thing for bankers and nannies, not for people with souls. Sex story detour. The painter Aubrey Beardsley, whose decadent, erotic illustrations scandalized even the French, was said to work best during the haunted hours between midnight and 4. One of his lovers claimed he could only be seduced if the clock struck 3 and he had paint still drying on his fingers. He designed bedrooms that mimicked opium dens, low ceilings, red curtains, velvet floor cushions, and believed that insomnia was the true aphrodisiac. He died young, of tuberculosis, with a final sketch unfinished. It was of a naked woman sleeping on a bed made of ink. Historians still debate whether he envied her or feared her. Meanwhile, critics and doctors tried to reclaim the narrative. They published scathing articles warning that romanticizing insomnia was dangerous, that it led to madness, addiction, early death. They weren't wrong, but they were ignored. Because once a thing becomes beautiful, it's hard to see it as harmful, especially when that beauty is framed as noble suffering. Especially when you're desperate for your own agony to mean something. Fringe example. The poet Lionel Griffiths published a chapbook titled The Sleep That Fled. It sold almost nothing. But in it, he included a manifesto. Let no man pity. The insomniac. We are the astronomers of the soul. We chart what others dare not see. He later attempted to found a philosophical movement called nocturnalism, which preached that sleep was a form of cowardice. He was institutionalized after attempting to convert strangers on the street by ringing a bell and reciting his dreams. His bell is now in a museum. His poems are not. Historians still argue whether this cult of sleeplessness was a desperate attempt to find purpose in pain, or a legitimate artistic movement. Probably both. Because the truth is, insomnia does do something to you. It changes how you see, how you feel. The line between reality and imagination blurs. Time stretches, emotions sharpen. The world becomes both unbearably loud and eerily silent. And for some, that distortion is terrifying. But for others, it's the closest they'll ever come to transcendence. You tonight are somewhere in between. You're not writing a masterpiece. You're not painting by candlelight. But you're awake, again, and your thoughts are louder than ever. You wonder if this is your great moment of clarity, or just another loop of overthinking dressed in dramatic lighting. You tell yourself it's fine, that the artists were right, that sleep is overrated, that this pain must be doing something to your brain that matters. You reread a line of poetry you don't quite understand. You pour another cup of something bitter. You tell yourself that if you just stay awake a little longer, you'll break through, and maybe you will. Or maybe you'll just nod off in your chair, ink staining your wrist, the candle burning down to a final flicker. Maybe you'll wake up in an hour and realize you dreamed of nothing. Or maybe you'll dream of yourself, sitting exactly where you are, watching the flame, waiting for sleep like a lover who never shows up, but always keeps you dressed. There's a moment, just before dawn, when the air changes. It's not warmer, not yet. It's not brighter. But it feels different, thinner, as if the world itself is holding its breath. That's when the birds begin. Not in joyful chorus, but in single hesitant notes, like someone testing whether it's safe to speak. You hear it from your window, one chirp, then two, and your body tightens, because that sound doesn't mean rest. It means you've made it to morning again, awake, unbroken, but not victorious. You didn't win anything, you just didn't sleep. And now you have to pretend you did. Because in the grand Victorian theater of health, virtue, and social performance, nothing is more crucial than the lie of being well rested. You shuffle to the mirror. Your face doesn't look like a poet's or a dreamer's. It looks like a crime scene. Eyes raw, skin waxy, lips cracked. You splash water, pinch your cheeks, even practice a smile. It's not for vanity, it's for survival. Because today, like every day, you'll be expected to function, to be agreeable, to sit through breakfast without stabbing your fork into the sugar bowl. You'll answer to your employer, your spouse, your children, your friends. You'll say, "I didn't sleep well," and they'll laugh politely and say, "Oh, me too." But you'll know the difference. You weren't sleepless. You were somewhere else, somewhere darker, somewhere unspeakable. The final irony of Victorian insomnia is that after all the pamphlets, punishments, devices, and diagnoses, the thing people feared most about it was how invisible it could be. You could be utterly wrecked inside and still look like everyone else. You could be gasping beneath your corset or twitching under your cravat, and no one would notice unless you let it slip. So the era cultivated masks. Sleep was not just a bodily function, it was a social duty. And failing to perform it was akin to failing to be fully human. Let's close with one last story. A quiet one. In the year 1899, a woman known only as Missa kept a sleep log. Not because a doctor told her to, and not for publication, just for herself. She lived alone, taught piano, drank tea, and wrote down what her nights felt like. Not the hours, not the science, just the sensations. One entry reads, "Tonight I dreamt of nothing but still woke in tears." Another, "Sleep arrived like a shy child, touched my foot, then ran." Her final entry, on December 31st, simply says, "It is snowing. I am not afraid of morning anymore." The log ends there. No resolution, no cure. Just a quiet surrender. A quiet survival. Historians never found her real name. But her notebook is preserved. It sits in a climate-controlled drawer in a museum that rarely opens its sleep collection to the public. But if you ask politely, they'll show it to you. It's small. Soft leather, pages yellowed at the edges. Inside, the handwriting curves like waves. You can almost hear her voice. You can almost see her lying awake, listening to the snow fall against the glass. Not healed, not heroic. Just human. And that's the truth, isn't it? Victorian insomnia wasn't just about sex or sin or medicine or madness. It was about being human in a world that punished humanity. About what happens when a culture demands perfection and obedience from bodies that are built for mess, for desire, for stillness, for chaos. It was about the war between how you felt and how you were supposed to look. Between what your body wanted and what society told you it deserved. You now listening to this, lying in your own bed, are not a Victorian. But the echoes are still there. In the guilt you feel when you can't sleep. In the shame that creeps in when your mind won't shut off. In the silent pressure to wake up refreshed, to smile through the haze, to pretend you're fine. You are not a patient. You are not a failure. You are not alone. You are simply tired. And that's okay. So now, let's exhale together. Let's loosen the grip. The story's done. The lamps are dimmed. The ghosts have said their piece. And though sleep may still dance just out of reach, you don't have to chase it. Let it come to you. Let it find you exactly as you are, aching, blinking, quietly waiting. Now, as the candle guttered and the Final thread of thought drifts into silence. Let your body settle. Feel the bed beneath you less like a battleground, more like a raft. You've journeyed far tonight, through powdered corridors and flickering fears, through whispered prayers and tightening laces. You've sat beside mad poets, slipped through gaslit streets, and run your fingers along the bruised edge of empire. But now, none of that matters. Let the doctors hush. Let the clocks stop clicking. Let the guilt melt off your bones like snow from a warm roof. There's nothing to fix tonight, no secrets to hide, no letters to write. You are not being watched. You are not being judged. You are only breathing. Feel the rise of your chest, the weight of your blanket, the stillness in your jaw. Let your eyes soften, not close, not yet, just soften. Imagine a quiet room with no door. Imagine a forest where nothing hunts. Imagine a sea that doesn't pull. You don't need to earn this peace. You only need to allow it. And if your thoughts come knocking again, let them pass like a train you're not boarding. You're staying. Right here, safe, silent. Enough. Sleep, when it comes, will not be a command. It will be a kindness. It will be a hand on your back, a whisper without words. And if it doesn't come tonight, that's all right too. You've already survived more than most people dream of. End of script. Sweet dreams.